Meizu, a company you've probably never heard of, has developed a phone called the Meizu Zero, with the primary goal of being the first phone in this race that hasn't started yet to get to a phone with no ports or no holes, as many brands are calling it, except for the microphone holes, because if you see the promotional images, you'll see that, yeah, the companies haven't figured out a way to have microphones on a phone without having holes, but I think we're all okay with that. I've never heard that complaint, but there's no buttons, there's no speaker grill, there's no charge port, no headphone jack, no SIM card tray either, just eSIM. The phone actually ships with a wireless charger out of the box, which is definitely a first in many ways, and I think that was the only goal with this phone, but in case you were wondering why they call it the Meizu Zero, it's because that's how many people are gonna buy this thing, right? Let's begin. So this is obviously a phone I think mainly was developed so that people would know about this company, because clearly not that many people do. In case, if you're wondering if this is a bizarre thing, or hey, why don't you know what, an Android company beat Apple to the punch, they removed the charge port before Apple did. This would not be an uncommon thing. Before the iPhone 7 came out, notoriously known as the first phone to remove the headphone jack, except it wasn't the first phone to remove the headphone jack. Perhaps it was probably one of the most popular phones to remove the headphone jack, for sure, but before the iPhone 7 came out, there was the Moto Z, which also beat Apple to the punch and removed the headphone jack and sported only a USB-C charge port several months before the iPhone 7 dropped. But even before the Moto Z was announced, with all of their module coolness on the back, the Oppo R5 was actually a phone barely anyone heard of, but removed the headphone jack long before Apple even was thinking about it. That's not true. Apple was always thinking about it ever since iPod Shuffle days. I bet Tim and Steve were looking at it going, how can we remove the headphone jack from the iPod Shuffle? How would you charge it at that point? I don't know. But simultaneously, we're seeing similar trends, hopefully done much earlier before Apple actually partakes. But we know from leaks and rumors that Apple considered removing the charge port on the iPhone 10, probably because Apple likes to remove cables if at all possible, even if that means having a less efficient way of charging your phone and a more inconvenient way of having to charge up stuff or output video through the Lightning port. It would definitely change up the game a lot, and the fact that iPhone sales are continuously dropping, it may not be the best idea, and it may not happen at all for a very long time, but Meizu and also Vivo Apex wanted to make sure they beat Apple to the punch so they could be remembered as the first phones to remove the charge port. What advantages does actually removing the charge port have other than aesthetically? I guess it can look kind of cool. Maybe some people like that look, but I mean, the Meizu Zero doesn't have overly fancy water resistance. It does have IP68 water resistance, but I imagine that wasn't that hard because the only opening on the whole device is those microphone holes. As long as you got sealant over those, you're good. There's no other holes or pores for water to get into. In case you're wondering how the speakers work, the glass vibrates in a way that's able to imitate a speaker's sound. I have not used a phone that uses that type of technology in person, so I'm not sure if that speaker technology is much better than what we have right now with speaker grills, but I imagine probably isn't. The glass shaking, really? That's how you're gonna emit sound? That would just feel like the phone's vibrating beyond belief, but I don't know for sure. Maybe it works pretty well, and we'll start seeing major smartphone companies start implementing it in their phones. But also with the no buttons thing, a lot of people wondering, how do you turn this phone off? Well, similar to earlier HTC phones, this has pressure sensitive sides that give you haptic feedback when you press the phone in certain ways. So basically the buttons are kind of there, but they're invisible. Again, I'm not exactly sure who is complaining about this. I have a definite big bunch of questions, like when you first unbox this phone, what button do you press to turn it on? Because if the phone is all the way off, how does it know when to register that a button is being clicked, given that there's no actual button? It's just pressure sensitivity, which I assume has to be monitored by the innards of the phone, but volume control works the same way. The interesting part of that is perhaps you could customize like the button layout. You could have volume on one side and power on the other, or maybe you want volume and power right next to each other, like on a Pixel, or perhaps you want power on one side and volume on the other. I guess you could move that around and it could give you some level of customization that you didn't have before, because you could put buttons anywhere. Perhaps you can add buttons for the people out there who want a Bixby button or want a mappable button to a Google Assistant or the camera. Perhaps having pressure sensitive sides would allow you to do something like that, but again, quite bizarre of a design choice. And then almost like the following day, Vivo Apex wanted to beat Meizu to the punch, but they were just 24 hours late and released the 2019 version of the Vivo Apex, which in my opinion is probably the dumbest phone out of the two we're talking about today. Despite you thinking that Meizu Zero is a bad idea, Media, wait till you get a piece of the Vivo Apex, because a lot of people were complimenting the Apex last year and saying, this is the future of smartphones, this is really cool, and by the way, all these thin bezels, and it still has a headphone jack. Well, Vivo Apex 2019 doesn't have a headphone jack. It also doesn't have a charge port, or a front-facing camera, or a pop-up camera. There's just no front-facing camera now, which is kind of weird. And on top of that, this is the real doozy, no charge port, and also no wireless charging. What? Yeah, no, you read that right. They made a phone without a charge port and no wireless charging. So is this some kind of disposable phone that you use for like 10 hours and then you throw it in the garbage, it's dead? No, with the Vivo Apex, they wanted to have a rear-mounted line of pins that must have some type of MagSafe type of cable that attaches to the back where it transfers power and data. And I wish I could say these are simply concept phones that are not meant to sell, but they do plan on selling these, which is kind of weird. The only interesting thing about the Vivo Apex 2019 is that they've developed some type of way to have a fingerprint reader built into the display, except it's built into the entire display. It literally works on every corner of the screen, which simply means wherever you tap the display, as long as you tap it with a registered fingerprint, the phone will unlock. I don't imagine it's as quick as you and I would think just tapping the display is. Perhaps you have to tap and hold, but it's kind of interesting that it works on every part of the screen. We haven't seen that before. I guess it's kind of interesting. But yes, other Android companies out there are beating Apple to the punch when it comes to removing all ports, though I have to imagine Apple doesn't make too many changes at once, and if someday Apple does remove the Lightning port, we can only hope that it's at a time when they figure out how to make wireless charging work over the air a little bit more. Not very far, probably a foot or at maximum like 3 feet away. There's these wireless charging companies out there that have claimed to figure that kind of stuff out, and they say, we've figured out how to charge phones over the air, but they never actually release the product. So it's hard to say when that technology will be ready, but I imagine if Apple wanted to ditch the charge port and push wireless all the way, they probably wouldn't also ditch the buttons and also ditch the speaker grill all at the same time. I feel like that would be too much change for people, given we're pretty happy with our speaker setups as it is, and we're also pretty happy with the fact that we have buttons. I just can't imagine the kind of nightmare getting the Mizu Zero into boot loop would cost. It's like, okay, you can't force restart it because the buttons are part of the OS, and also you can't hard reset it or charge it because there's no charge port, so you just have to leave it on a wireless charger, but yeah, that would be a big mess. But can't you imagine someday in the future, wireless charging technology gets good enough that they can do it over the air, so Apple removes it from the iPhone, and then they include a wireless charger when you buy a new iPhone instead of those stupid 5-watt cables, and then they also include AirPods at the same time. I know that may make the iPhone overall more expensive, but just to get that type of package where you get everything wireless in one purchase, I think that'd be a pretty interesting future. Even if you already owned AirPods, I wouldn't mind buying an iPhone and getting a new pair of AirPods with it, even if that makes the price a little bit higher. For those curious, I definitely do not think in 2019 we're ready to remove the charge port. It's very, very premature. Seeing the holdups with things like AirPower, I completely admit we're not ready to ditch the charge port on the iPhone, and as Renee Ritchie has mentioned, you better make sure that your force restart and your OS doesn't crash that much, because if you don't have a charge port, there's not a lot of backups you can do. If you're relying on everything going over the air, you could run into some problems when it comes to boot loops or force restarts, so you have to make sure that's like dang near perfect. Anyway, what do you guys think of portless phones? Would you be interested in one, or do you hope that never happens? If you want the charge port to stay, how long? Do you think we'll have a charge port on phones 50 years, 100 years from now? At some point, it's probably gonna go. It's just a matter of time. All that good stuff. Let me know what you're thinking down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.